We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. Caroline, being quiet or being silent isn't something that we talk a lot about either on this programme or that we see a lot in the world of politics, but it's actually quite central to one of the events happening in Westminster today.
Yes.
And this is around the Post Office Horizon scandal back being discussed by the Commons Business and Trade Committee, and a lot of discussion going to be had about Fujitsu. This is the Japanese company responsible for making the Horizon software that's been central to this scandal that's seen the wrongful conviction of post office managers. Of course, we've been talking about it so much because of the ITV drama. And actually, Alan Bates, the man who inspired the title of that ITV drama, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, is one of those who's going to be speaking to the Commons Business and Trade Committee today. Let's take a listen to some of what he's been saying.
I hope it sends a warning shot across the bows of these big corporations that what they actually do and decide and the way they work really affects people right down at the front line of their organisations, and I think it's one of the failings there has been with a lot of the other things like the banking scandals or blood scandals. People in jobs of high responsibility, that they're not being held to account at the end of the day.
So that was Alan Bates there speaking to MPs on the Commons Business and Trade Committee. But as I say, Fujitsu very much in focus as well.
Yes, because their European CEO, Paul Patterson, is speaking to this committee too. It is a typical playbook of Japanese businesses and actually often Japanese politicians too, to say nothing, even in the face of very bad news. But actually, some of our Bloomberg reporters and writers have said, look, this is a mistake. Fujitsu's position as the only Japanese strategic supplier to the UK government is now potentially under threat because of this turmoil. So I think it's going to be very interesting to understand what Fujitsu's position is. One of the analysts who covers this points out that Fujitsu's UK business is the most profitable for it in the whole of Europe. The shares have definitely been affected. And so what they're going to say about this dubious software, which actually, when you dig into the detail, was created initially by a UK business, International Computers. It's a very old a British company that Fujitsu then bought in the 1990s. What are they going to say about how much of this, is their problem and the whole history of this scandal?
Yeah, and of course, the question of whether or not they could be contributing to a compensation scheme, something that's going to be unpicked by MPs as well. But it's led us to think a little bit about the whole idea of how these contracts are handed out and how they're supervised. I was looking at a paper from the Institute of Government looking at this as well, saying that actually their research has found that government contracts are often very poorly managed, and it can be very difficult for the government to get out of contracts that aren't working in their favour. And they say there are several examples of this as well. There is a new piece of legislation, the Procurement Act, passed last year, comes into force later this year, which may help to change that as well. And we've also been hearing from the head of the National Audit Office on this subject too. Yeah,
this is Gareth Davies, who's speaking to MPs today. He has also spoken to the Financial Times sort of in advance of this, and he paints a really grim picture that the government and UK institutions have out-of-date IT systems, crumbling infrastructure and a growing maintenance backlog. So it kind of raises very, very broad issues about IT systems, a number of which in terms of upgrades have failed in the past too.
Yeah, and look, there's a question of functioning of government here as well, which we wanted to bring in our guest to discuss. This is Professor Colin Talbot, who is Emeritus Professor of Government at the University of Manchester and someone who is an expert on this subject. Professor Talbot, great to have you with us on Bloomberg UK Politics. When you think about the Post Office scandal, the Horizon scandal, of course, brought to the fore by the ITV drama most recently, how much would you characterise this as a scandal around dysfunction of government?
I think it is very much about dysfunction of government. But just in terms of context, first of all, Gareth Davies' remarks, I think it's important to understand that the NAO, the National Audit Office, has limits on what it can say. First of all, it can't say anything about government policy. So it can't say Horizon was a good idea or a bad idea, or the northern part of HS2 was a good idea or a bad idea. All it can comment on is the implementation. Unlike its American counterpart, which can criticise policy. And the other thing is that the NAO has limited scope in terms of the whole public sector, because, of course, an awful lot of procurement takes place outside of government departments, which the NAO doesn't cover, really. But their comments are fairly clear that there are major failings in the procurement system. They estimate £7 billion worth of potential savings if it was conducted better. And they've got some suggestions about ways in which that could be done, particularly for these large mega projects like Horizon or the NHS IT system, which failed spectacularly and cost £10 billion.
Yeah. Do you think that is going to be heeded? Do you think that the issues around these IT failures, that the government is going to learn lessons from these? I mean, this is an unbelievably long-running scandal.
Bluntly, no. I mean, there were people raising questions about the Horizon system. Sir Jeff Mulgan now, who worked in the Cabinet Office in 98, 99 under Tony Blair, raised concerns about Horizon way back then and said that he thought it was a bad idea and they shouldn't have got into the procurement at all, and was ignored. I don't see, particularly at the moment when we're in an election year, the current government certainly getting to grips with this, and it'll be long after the next election before any government, incoming government, can actually start to get to grips with this.
We mentioned that there was a new bit of legislation that was brought in October, the Procurement Act. The unions have been very critical of that, including this, I think is interesting, from the TUC General Secretary Paul Novak. Ministers must call time on failed outsourcing. Public services should be run in the public interest, not for profit. Do you think that's the answer, that we have, procurement that is done sort of in the interest of government on a not-for-profit basis? Is it possible?
No, but it is possible to put in place limits on what sort of profits can be made out of public sector contracts. I mean, the usual baseline is that you expect companies to make about a 5% margin on net margin on government contracts. And that's not been implemented terribly well. Don't forget, we're in the aftermath of the COVID crisis where public procurement really fell to pieces completely. And we've seen all sorts of examples of scandals and problems, particularly the VIP lane for PPE purchasing. And government's got an awful lot of ground to make up to recover from that and to try and repair some of the damage that was done during that time.
How difficult is it to fix this system, though? Because a lot of these contracts are long-term and will run for years. How long could it take to improve this, make these contracts better supervised, more efficient and better value for money?
Well, my personal view is it would take at least a term of government, 5 years or so, to put in place the necessary structures and systems to improve this greatly. But more importantly, I think it needs a really serious rethink about how we do public procurement. In my time of engagement with these issues, which stretches back nearly 4 decades now, we've tended to swing from over-centralisation and one-size-fits-all public purchasing arrangements to highly decentralised ones and letting 1,000 flowers bloom. There's somewhere in between those two extremes, and particularly procurement policies and processes which are fit for the purpose for the things that they're actually dealing with, because obviously these mega projects are very different from day-to-day purchasing for supplies for hospitals or schools, and we need systems which are adapted to all of those. The other major problem that I've seen, and I should say I've worked on the practical end of this as well. I worked for British Telecom for 5 years and local government for 6 years, and local government for 6 years before I became an academic. I'm involved with IT systems. One of the things I've noticed is that there's a tendency to place overly specified contracts, which the IT sector love, because it then means loads of changes to the contracts, and that's where they make their money, on contract variations. And there's also a problem with particularly politicians, but also some senior civil servants, going from being what I would call technophobes to being technophiles overnight, and not really understanding the technology that they're dealing with. And the third thing I'd raise is that there's also been a tendency to design IT systems around current ways of working, rather than thinking about how do we want to work differently and then designing IT systems which support that. And I think that's been a fundamental mistake in a number of systems that I've seen.
Yeah, Colin, I think that's very interesting that you make those points. Do you think that Labour has got a grip of any of those sorts of issues, which are enormously strategically important for Britain going forwards?
I don't know is the answer. I mean, I have some engagement with some of the people around Labour policy making. The thing that surprised me over the last 24 months or so was, as Labour's clearly on course for a potential victory at the moment, is the lack of discussion around some of these things. Well, I mean, from when I first got involved in these issues back in the 1980s through to 2016, governments were obsessed with talking about management, organisation, efficiency issues in government. Since the Brexit referendum, it seems to have gone completely off the agenda, and there's hardly any discussion about it at all. There's been a few keynote speeches by people like Michael Gove and so on. But the whole public sector reform agenda seems to have disappeared. And interestingly, it's not really to the fore in thinking amongst the sort of think tank world where you would expect a lot of this to be going on at the moment. Certainly not in the way it was before 1997, where there were all sorts of discussions about how to improve the working of government.
Fascinating. Colin Talbot, Emeritus Professor of Government at the University of Manchester. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, some interesting points then about the Post Office Horizon scandal and its lessons.
Next to the latest ructions in the Conservative Party over the Rwanda deportation bill, the deputy chairman of the party, Lee Anderson, says he'll support rebel amendments to the draft law to make it tougher. This is Rishi Sunak's top political strategist has warned Conservative MPs to stop plotting against him or risk certain defeat in the general election. Let's get the details now from Bloomberg's Alex Wickham, our senior government reporter. Alex, first of all, can you just talk us through what the amendments that are being discussed to the Rwanda bill actually are?
Sure. So the right-wing Tory MPs once again are going for Rishi Sunak over his Rwanda legislation, trying to toughen it up essentially and close down what they see as loopholes in Sunak's proposed legislation that would allow asylum seekers to appeal deportations, go to court essentially at the last minute before they were put on flights to Rwanda and try and get those flights blocked. Now, what the right-wing rebels want is really to close down as many avenues as possible for those asylum seekers to be able to go to court. There are obviously problems with that. The centre of the Tory party, and indeed Rishi Sunak's own legal advice from government lawyers, says that if you go too far and really sort of blanket ban those sorts of appeals or make it almost impossible for asylum seekers to appeal, then that would breach international law. So that's the sort of conundrum that Rishi Sunak is facing at the moment. How does he placate those right-wing backbenchers, and how does he stay within the sort of boundaries of international law?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just Lee Anderson. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has backed this idea. He's talked about making the bill, quote, as legally robust as possible, and that other governments around the world are tracking the UK and following their lead.
Yeah, and that really does show that there is a bit of a proxy going on here, proxy battle with Rishi Sunak and his enemies in the Conservative Party. The reality is there are lots of people in the Tory party that don't like Rishi Sunak, and they span different factions of the party, but the numbers are not insignificant. There were 29 abstentions the last time this Rwanda legislation came to the House. It's a big if, but if those Tory rebels manage to, basically decide on a full-blown rebellion, then that would put the Prime Minister in trouble. However, Sunak and his number 10 aides are still confident that they could essentially face down this rebellion from the right and get the legislation through pretty much as worded at the moment, maybe with a few little clarifications, but nothing too significant, and essentially say to the right wing, look, if you want to vote down this bill, then it kills the Rwanda plan forever. It causes another Tory leadership psychodrama before the next general election. It makes the public see that we're all arguing with each other. Is that really what you want? And the question, I think, really today is how many of those rebels do want that?
Yeah, but Alex, I mean, this isn't the first time that we've talked to you about a brewing rebellion in the Tory party in, I would even say, recent weeks, if not recent months. How serious does it feel this time around? Will the argument coming from number 10 have enough resonance with those Tory MPs who are unhappy with this bill as it stands?
I think the central scenario, as things stand at the moment, is that number 10 will win the vote, that Rishi Sunak will get this Rwanda legislation through the House of Commons at least. It then would go to the House of Lords for further scrutiny. But there is always the possibility that things go wrong. And, we've got essentially until Wednesday night, where the big vote on the third reading, the final vote in the Commons on this bill will take place. That's when we know how serious the rebellion against Rishi Sunak is. And, in those conversations that are taking place between the rebels and the government whips and Downing Street advisors today, there is potential for things to spill over into something a bit more full-blown. However, number 10 still confident that they'll get this through relatively unamended, but we will see.
Yeah, and there's also a kind of bigger concern that I start to see filtering through in, for example, this piece that I read the other day in The Spectator. Could a 1997-style wipeout spell the end of the Tories? I mean, there's also a thrust that in this general election year that, there's perhaps a significant issue with Tory unity.
Absolutely. Party management, as Rishi Sunak is finding out, is almost impossible. There are so many. The Tories have been in for 14 years, and over time, it builds up all these sorts of personal resentments and ideological differences. Especially that's really come into focus since Brexit, really, for the Tory party, where they've had all these changes of prime ministers, 5 prime ministers in 8 years. And that is sort of made worse when you see those big polls come out showing that Labour are on course for a huge victory. It just makes Tory MPs absolutely full of doom and gloom. And some of them do have this sort of mindset that it can't get any worse than this. And we do need to challenge the Prime Minister now, because otherwise we're sort of, heading for the iceberg. I would say I think the majority of Tory MPs don't think that. The majority of Tory MPs think the public wouldn't look kindly on another leadership change before the election. And that should mean that Rishi Sunak does stay in place until the election. But it does mean that every now and then, as with this week, and as you were saying just a few weeks ago, we get these sorts of very noisy weeks where that sort of discontent bubbles up again, and that's what is happening this week. And each time it does pose a threat to Sunak, and he has to fend it off. And he just has to hope that as they get close to the election, Tory MPs, as Isaac Libido, their chief campaign strategist, was saying yesterday, they need to unite and stop squabbling.
Yeah, indeed, you've been reporting on the comments by Isaac Libido at that closed-door meeting of backbench Tory MPs. I mean, is it an argument really that lands, though? Because, I mean, the gap in the polls are so large at the moment with Labour that maintaining party discipline is extremely difficult. Is this a question that the Tories can be saved from anything but an absolutely parlous election performance?
That's the problem for Tory MPs, is that Isaac Levido probably does have the right strategy, I think most of them would say, which is talk about the economy, hope the economy gets better through this year, hope that inflation really comes down very quickly, hope that people feel slightly better off than they were last year and see a few good news headlines in the news for a few months in a row, feel a bit better after the summer, and perhaps that will prevent such a huge, disastrous defeat for the Tories. Most, I think, MPs think that probably is the right strategy. However, they also simultaneously think it's not a very inspiring strategy that's going to deliver the Tories anything, like an election victory. And that is essentially the problem for Rishi Sunak, is he may just find that there's no strategy, there's no sort of political wizardry that anyone could come up with that could get the Tories out of the mess that they found themselves in after this time of power, all the political and economic turmoil of the last few years. Polls do really consistently show that at the moment there is this sort of real desire for just a change from the public, and that is such a hard thing for Rishi Sunak to deal with, and that's why you get these Tory MPs who sort of say, okay, I understand your strategy, but we need something more.
Bloomberg's Alex Wickham, thank you so much for being with us. Alex, one last thought though. What actually happens if, the bill fails, or what, are they just going to try to avoid a vote? How do they handle it actually in the next couple of days?
I think that there is a small chance that the rebels suddenly do pick up growing numbers and seriously threaten to block this legislation. That would put Sunak in a very tough situation where he would either have to pull the legislation rather than face the humiliation of losing it, or if he went to a vote on a knife edge and lost that vote, I suspect he would then have to turn around and say, well, look, there's no prospect of the Rwanda plan working now. It's been rejected by Parliament, so I need to come up with something else on illegal migration. The problem for him is that would be such a huge challenge to his authority that we would all be asking questions, and I think Tory MPs would be asking questions, is whether Rishi Sunak can lead the Tories into the election. But still, that's the less likely scenario at the moment.
OK, Alex Wickham, our senior government reporter, thanks very much. Well, while there's plenty happening in Westminster, we're also keeping across the conversations happening in Davos at the World Economic Forum. Francine Aqua has been speaking to Charlie Nunn, the CEO of Lloyds Banking Group, about the outlook for the UK economy and the risks that it faces in an election year. Let's take a listen.
Obviously, we've had an unexpected 2 years. It's been difficult for our customers, but the economy's been more resilient than we thought may be the case in 2023. And we've been really focused on transforming the bank, but also getting some growth. And we're seeing good growth in the businesses we set out to try and grow for 2024 and 2026. So we're on track.
Yeah, so where are you seeing the most growth? I guess when you look at credit cards, when you look at mortgages, how's the UK consumer doing?
So the UK consumer's had a difficult time. And we all know the cost of living crisis has been difficult, and obviously with higher interest rates, we're still seeing challenges for those people with mortgages who are repricing up to higher levels. But actually the UK consumer and businesses have been really resilient. We haven't seen people defaulting at the kind of scales we've seen in previous cycles. We still see 20% of people really struggling to make ends meet, but adapting, and less than 1% of people really struggling and not being able to make ends meet. So the UK consumer's been adapting well. And we're seeing the growth across Lloyds Banking Group, across our corporate and institutional businesses, as people are looking to invest and for the future, and foreign direct investment for the future growth in infrastructure, all the way through to individuals and households looking to save more and to try and build their financial resilience.
But is that resilience very surprising? Could something go wrong this year, or do you think we're actually over the worst because now mortgage rates are meant to start coming down?
Well, we haven't updated our forecasts for 2024 yet. We're doing that at year-end results. But our forward-look view is actually next year, this year, 2024, is probably going to be similar to 2023. Pretty low growth, less than 1% growth. Resilient unemployment, but some growth in unemployment. And house prices slightly negative. So unexciting. I think the challenge for many people is the geopolitical risk and just the election cycle globally, which is creating uncertainty.
Yep.
And so we do think this year is going to be challenging. struggling. But within that, there's opportunities to really work with and invest with our customers in different sectors and businesses and to try and invest for the future, which is what we're focused on.
So, what does that mean for a reduction in mortgage rates for your customer base?
So mortgage rates have already started coming down.
Yeah.
As you know, in the UK, most people look for either a 2 or 5 year mortgage, and that's based off the forward swap curve. And the swap curves have already come down significantly from the peaks that we saw at the half year last year. We don't think the rates will probably come back down to the levels we saw pre-COVID or pre this interest rate cycle, just because of the level of government debt and spending and the state of the economies across the world. So lower mortgages already, and we see that continuing going forward. The good news is that happens before the Bank of England's base rate comes down.
Right. So how does it feel being a UK chief executive at the moment in Davos? There are so many crises that you've mentioned, be it trade, geopolitics, a lot of the concerns out there. The UK election year actually looks pretty stable. Am I wrong?
No, I agree. So as I said, the economy looks resilient. We're going through an election cycle. Always it will be helpful to have clarity for businesses and for people looking to invest into the UK about the future. And we're very focused on working with the government and trying to set that foundation for the future. But the UK economy looks good at the moment. The challenge, as I said, is the uncertainty geopolitically, which would come back on the UK more in second-order consequences through energy prices or the supply chain costs increasing. And so we're watching very carefully as to what's going on in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and then for other elections around the world.
But again, how exactly does that impact you, apart from market swings? And is there anything that you can do to be even more adaptable and adjust?
So the main thing for us is to worry about how imported inflation will impact our customers through 2024 and beyond. We don't think that's an issue at the moment, but obviously the geopolitical instability could create that. On top of that, it's really focusing on the day-to-day issues for our customers. As we were saying, households are still struggling for some parts of society in the UK, and we're seeing people going on to higher mortgage rates, dealing with those high mortgage rates. Businesses have been really resilient, and actually there's some more positive business sentiment in the UK, but cash flows are weaker than they were pre-COVID now, or the same level pre-COVID, and some sectors are stressed. So it's really working with those businesses to make sure they navigate 2024. And then what we're very focused on as we grow Lloyds Banking Group is how do we get the UK investing and driving productivity growth over the next 3 to 5 years.
So in November, you also called on, I guess, the UK government to invest more for the green transition, to give a little bit of a helping hand. Who's listening?
Well, there's two things actually we called for. One is housing in the UK, which is linked actually to the green transition. We've been calling for building 1 million new social homes over the next 10 years. It's really important for the housing market to get more supply. And actually, as we all know, at the moment with higher rates, less houses are being built. And then the second thing is the investment in, as you say, transition technologies and some of the core sectors. We're seeing people listening from foreign direct investors to domestic businesses through to the government, thinking about how can we channel more money into those infrastructure projects and create the jobs and the skills for the future, whether it's energy or the built environment or transport, where we're also a leader in financing green transport. So there is real focus on it.
Right, but is it the Tories or Labour? I mean, Labour is still 20 points ahead. We have an election in the next 12 months.
So Lloyds Banking Group's been here for over 300 years. We'll work with the government that's in power. So we're obviously working with all political parties to try and shape the future. And we're working closely with both the Conservatives and the government that we have today, and also making sure that the ideas that we have are available to other parties that want to see them.
So I know you look at, of course, the housing market very, very closely. Are you worried about 2024 for housing, for house prices, and people being able to get on the ladder?
So 2023 was more resilient than we predicted. House prices came down about 2%. We think 2024 will be similar. It's very hard to predict house prices because of the lack of supply that happens. Obviously, on a real basis, house prices have fallen much more significantly, and so we look at that carefully. And in terms of affordability, we're back to about 2017, 2018 levels because people's salaries have increased, but house prices have come down. And that means there should be a bit more resilience, we think, in the housing market. Obviously, how the rates curves evolve, linked to geopolitics, will be an important driver of whether people feel comfortable selling their house or committing to a mortgage, which is, as we know, the biggest purchase in most people's lives.
So that was Charlie Nunn, the CEO of Lloyds Banking Group, then on the outlook for the economy. Of course, so much of the political world rests actually on the economic fortunes for the UK in the next few months.
Yeah, and plenty more of those conversations to come to at the World Economic Forum this week. That's it from us for today, though. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.